The wisdom of the United States Senate, we have 7 hearings going on at the same time. So trying to deal with all the responsibilities on the various committees in a way that's appropriate is sometimes a challenge, so I apologize for being a few minutes late. I've had a chance to greet the witnesses that are here this morning, and I will give my opening statement. Certainly welcome the opportunity of Senator Hassan to make an opening statement, but I just want everyone to understand this is just the first of what I hope will be many opportunities that we will have to look at the depth and breadth of the opioid problem in this country. There is not one answer, there are many answers. There is not one problem, there are many problems. And it's incumbent on us to shine a bright light everywhere we need to shine it to uncover some of the wrongdoing that has occurred and some of the lapses of services and support that we do not have in this country. In the United States today, too many opioids are prescribed, too many are abused, and too many are purchased by the federal government. Medicare Part D spending on commonly abused opioids increased 165% between 2006 and 2015. And 1 out of 3 Part D recipients received at least one prescription opioid in 2016 at the cost of $4.1 billion. New provisional data from the CDC shows that drug deaths from fentanyl more than doubled from 2015 to 2016, and opioid-related hospitalizations and emergency room visits in Missouri, like so many other states, have doubled in the last decade. In just one troubling example, the former deputy police chief of Poplar Bluff, Missouri, estimated last summer that 70% of the crime his department encounters relates directly to opioids and other illegal drugs. These human costs are not the consequence of some natural disaster sweeping through our communities. This is not a hurricane. This is not a tornado. The opioid epidemic is the direct result of a calculated marketing and sales strategy developed in the 90s, which delivered 3 simple messages to physicians. First, that chronic pain was severely undertreated in the United States. Second, that opioids were the best tool to address that pain. And third, that opioids could treat pain without risk of serious addiction. As it turns out, these messages were exaggerations at best and outright lies at worst. But in the meantime, Purdue Pharma, the company responsible for this strategy, mobilized an army of sales representatives. Driven by lucrative bonuses, these representatives aggressively courted physicians and urged them to prescribe OxyContin for chronic pain management. As a result, OxyContin prescriptions for non-cancer pain increased tenfold between 1997 and 2002. New companies, in search of similar profits, have reportedly adopted the Purdue playbook to boost opioid prescriptions. One of these companies, Insys Therapeutics, manufactures a powerful fentanyl drug, Subsys, that is FDA approved only for breakthrough cancer pain. Let me repeat that. It is approved only for breakthrough cancer pain. Since approval of Subsys in 2012, Insys has allegedly pressured sales representatives to push Subsys for off-label uses, paid doctors thousands of dollars to participate in sham education programs, and maintained a unit inside the company to secure prior authorization for Subsys through misleading statements to pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, and other healthcare professionals. In fact, my staff has obtained a recording of a call one employee of this unit placed to a PBM to gain approval for a prescription for Subsys patient Sarah Fuller. As discussed in a report I released last week, this tape appears to confirm the allegations that Insys representatives have claimed to represent physicians, when in fact they work for what was known as the Insys Reimbursement Center. They were not with the doctor's office. They were not calling from a doctor's office. They were calling from a pharmaceutical manufacturer company, a company that manufactures fentanyl, to try to make sure that more people got fentanyl. It was about sales. It wasn't about pain or health. The tape also provides a stark example of how Insys employees leading PBMs to believe patients have suffered from breakthrough cancer pain, the only condition Subsys is approved to treat, when no such pain is present, when no cancer diagnosis is present. According to a document we received from the company, moreover, Insys officials were aware less than a year before these events that the company maintained no policies or monitoring procedures to prevent misleading statements to PBMs. Insys, in other words, knew this danger existed, and yet Sarah Fuller still received the prescriptions that ultimately led to her death. Meanwhile, the sales and marketing techniques Insys has employed have generated significant profits. Insys had the, quote, best performing initial public offering in 2013, end of quote. And revenue and profits tripled and rose 45% respectively over the next 2 years. The value of the company's stock rose 296% between 2013 and 2016, and Dr. John Kapoor, the founder and former CEO of Insys, became a billionaire in 2013. The concern is that the extraordinary profit Insys, Purdue, and other companies have made have set a pattern. A manufacturer enters the market with a new opioid product, aggressively pushes the product through illegal tactics, pays a fine, and when the cycle is over, enjoys the benefits of an entrenched market share. And this is a market share made up of millions of Americans who have suffered addiction or other injury as a result of opioid overprescription. People like Sarah Fuller and Jeffrey Buchalter. Mr. Buchalter and Ms. Fuller's family are pursuing damages against Insys in complaints filed in state court. I applaud their courage in taking a stand, but we know that lawsuits will not be enough to stop this epidemic. By the time a patient receives a courtroom award, the human cost has already been inflicted. And the result is a burden not only on private insurers or Medicare, but on the deputy police chief with too few resources, the treatment center with too few beds, the mother burying her child. To avoid these outcomes, we need to focus on abuse prevention, and this means investigating sales and marketing practices that treat addiction itself, not just the pill, as the product. As one former Insys sales representative has claimed, the motto of the company's approach to patient treatment was, quote, start them high and hope they don't die. Our national opioid epidemic is complex, but one explanation for this crisis is simple: pure greed. So I will continue to investigate the business practices at the root of this epidemic and whether they continue today. But it will be of great value to policymakers and all Americans to know more about the risk of opioid manufacturers fostering addiction when boosting their bottom line. Today, I want to give fellow members of Congress and the public an opportunity to hear from individuals familiar with the personal and professional cost of opioid sales and marketing techniques. Our panelists today are Deborah Fuller, the mother of former Subsys patient Sarah Fuller. And once again, let me express on behalf of the entire United States Senate how sorry we are about the loss of Sarah in your family. Jerry Buchalter, a veteran of our armed forces and a former Subsys patient. Dr. Adriane Fugh-Berman, associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology in the Department of Family Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. And Dr. David Fleming, professor emeritus of medicine and former chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Missouri in Columbia. He is also the founder and director of the MU Center for Health Ethics and served as the president of the American College of Physicians from 2014 to 2015. Senator Hassan and Senator Harris, you're welcome to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this roundtable on this important topic and for all the work that you and your office have done with this investigation over the past few months. As your report notes, the opioid epidemic has exacted a staggering toll on our people and on our country. And we certainly know that all too well in my state of New Hampshire, where our citizens have felt the impact of this crisis at even higher rates than most other places in the country. I want to thank, in particular, the witnesses who are here today, including the two of you who have very difficult personal stories to tell. As somebody who has worked on this issue, first as governor and now as a United States Senator, I can tell you your willingness to stand up and talk about what happened makes all the difference in the world. Because part of the reason we're here is because of the stigma that has traditionally been attached to substance misuse, as well as the stigma that has been attached at times to mental illness. And when people speak up and talk about their experiences, what happened to them, what happened to their loved ones, it makes it clear that this is an epidemic that strikes people from all walks of life in all circumstances. And it is an illness and a chronic one that needs treatment like any other. So I am very grateful that you are willing to share very difficult and painful stories to help make sure that the same things don't happen to some of your fellow citizens. I'm also very grateful to our two scientific and medical experts who are here as well, because we need all of your expertise as we battle this epidemic too. Unfortunately, the role that drug makers have played in contributing to this epidemic is abundantly clear. As Senator McCaskill's report highlights, drug makers have long used improper marketing of prescription opioids to mask the problems with these drugs. Reports like this one are really helpful to shine a light on some of the behavior that we're talking about here today. Another tool that we have at our disposal is litigation, including lawsuits brought by states' attorneys general. I was very proud to support the New Hampshire Department of Justice's investigation into claims regarding Purdue's fraudulent marketing of opioid products during my time as governor. Last month, the New Hampshire Department of Justice filed suit against Purdue Pharma for deceptive marketing practices of opioid products in violation of the State Consumer Protection Act, the Medicaid Fraud Act, and other state laws. It is absolutely critical that we continue to use all the tools that we have to help address this crisis and begin to truly turn the tide of what is a terrible, terrible epidemic. So I thank you all for being here today. I will give some apologies in advance. I'm one of the senators with about 4 simultaneous hearings, so I'll be in and out, but we are incredibly grateful that you are here today. And again, I want to thank Senator McCaskill for all the work she and her office have done to shine a light on particular on this part of this very difficult epidemic.
Thank you. I, too, want to thank Senator McCaskill. You've been talking about this with us privately and publicly for a very long time, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today. The witnesses in particular, who I also want to thank for your courage of being here with us and sharing your stories, including and knowing the pain that it causes to tell it each time. I thank you because you are here speaking on behalf of many people whose voice must be heard, and you're speaking on behalf of people that you'll probably never meet, people who may never know your name, but the work you're doing and the courage you're showing is going to benefit them all. The opioid epidemic is a public health emergency. There's no question. Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death from unintentional injury in the United States. More than 4,600 Californians died from an overdose in 2015. According to a recent poll by the American Psychiatric Association, 1 in 4 Americans, including 1 in 3 millennials, know someone who is addicted to opioids. And that's in the United States alone. To address this crisis, we need to take a public health approach, and that means supporting treatment and prevention. We must speak truth. Our nation has an insatiable appetite for drugs. And addiction is colorblind. The crack epidemic of the 1990s, and that is when I started my career as a prosecutor, was similar to the opioid crisis of today. A key difference, however, is that back then drug companies were not boosting their profits often by illegal means, at the expense of lives. And when companies have acted irresponsibly or illegally, we must ensure that the federal government holds them accountable. When I was Attorney General of California, I filed dozens and dozens of lawsuits against pharmaceutical corporations and pill mill physicians, and obtained civil and criminal penalties, including jail sentences. And there's nothing like the threat of having to bring your toothbrush when you show up in court to encourage better behaviors. So whatever it takes, we must, as part of the leadership of our country, take seriously this epidemic, see the victims, and understand that where there is culpability, there must be consequence and accountability. And also, as a system, we must understand one of the best ways to deal with the addiction issue is through prevention and treatment and not criminalizing what is essentially a public health issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will begin our testimony this morning with Deborah Fuller.
It is impossible to put into words the pain and devastation that has been caused to my family and me as a result of the actions of Insys Therapeutics. I truly believe that only a parent who has lost a child can understand the nonstop anguish our family is forced to live with on a daily basis. Since receiving the devastating phone call on March 25, 2016, and being told that our precious Sarah had been taken from us, our lives have become a daily exercise of pushing through the pain just to get through another day. The void in our lives and in our hearts from losing Sarah has been overwhelming. Sarah was a sweet, generous young woman who loved life and was looking forward to getting married and having a family of her own. Sarah loved her family, her fiancé, her friends, their children. She loved her dogs. Now everything reminds us of Sarah. Seeing a dog on TV or a television show about wedding causes us to think of Sarah and brings on an onslaught of grief. Holidays are the worst of days, which we simply must endure as we share tears and reminisce about Sarah. Sarah's sister Barbara has been struggling with depression since Sarah's death and still cannot be left alone. Last week, instead of attending Sarah's wedding, we visited her gravestone. Instead of giving away the bride, my husband placed a cake topper and 2 champagne flutes on her grave. Losing a child is agonizing, but then learning that Sarah died from a drug that she should never have been prescribed has caused us so much more anguish and outrage. Learning of the massive fraud in which Insys was engaged to get people like Sarah to take Subsys really has made us question humanity. I also now know that Insys called Sarah's health insurer pretending to be calling from her doctor's office and lied, telling the insurance company that Sarah needed Subsys because she had cancer and was suffering from breakthrough cancer pain. That call was Insys' death wish for our daughter in exchange for profit. I also have learned that Insys ensured that the prescription for its deadly drug would be filled by an online pharmacy, Linden Care, who would look the other way and deliver a carton of deadly fentanyl directly to Sarah's doorstep. Every day of my life, I must live with the realization that Sarah is gone because of Insys' greed. I believe that Sarah's death certificate should be changed to indicate her death was a homicide, and a cause of death should be changed to corporate greed. The only thing that keeps us going at this point in our lives is the hope that the people who did this to my baby will be held accountable for their actions. We endure and share Sarah's story publicly, hoping that it may save just one person from dying from addictive and deadly opiates.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fuller, and please tell the rest of your family how grateful we are for your courage. Mr. Buchalter.
First off, thank you, Senator McCaskill, for chairing this event, and other distinguished members of the Roundtable for this opportunity to share my story. Nearly 10 years ago, in about June 2007, I found myself just a few metro stops away at Walter Reed. I was recovering from a multitude of both physical and psychological combat-related injuries that I sustained throughout my 2 combat deployments in Iraq. Reflecting back, I remember feeling lost, scared, certain I'd hit bottom. Without insight as to why or how, the prospect of separation from the Army, coupled with fear of an uncertain future, left me for the first time without clarity and without answers. It took nearly 2 tough, long, painfully long years of treatment and rehab, but finally, June 2009, with great fortune and some luck, life was looking up. I secured a job with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, an agency of DHS, as a law enforcement specialist here in Cheltenham, Maryland. I was a bit conflicted at first that I wouldn't be able to wear green to serve, but grateful at the opportunity to still serve this great nation. For the first time in 2 years, I was excited. I was once again afforded the opportunity to serve and provide for my family, and yet I did not have to worry about an IED or small arms attack. My family and I moved locally to Covert County in Maryland. It was an exciting time. My daughter, at that time nearly 3, and my son just turned 3 months old. Life was getting back to normal, and I was now safe, or I thought. As establishing civilian care, I knew I needed to establish a continuity of my health care, both physical and mental. What I can now say retrospectively is that being young is often a blessing and a liability. So came the fateful day when I met Dr. William Tam, the doctor who prescribed me Subsys, and who I've subsequently learned was being paid by Insys. On election night 2012, Dr. Tam and Insys became the unknown enemy, and Subsys became the weapon. Somewhere between my first dosage totaling 1,200 micrograms a day to my last of 32,000 micrograms.
Oh my God.
I had become a full-blown addict and didn't even know it. I became absent from life, and again, without knowing why or how. The last several years have not been easy, to say the least, most specifically the last 18 months. I have learned some important truths, and to this day, as I sit feeling back at the bottom, new health issues arising every day, facing bankruptcy, the possible end of my marriage, and uncertainty as life as I knew it. However, my time in Iraq and Walter Reed taught me about the nature of survival and the power of redemption. So I stand before you today to share my story, answer any questions, and hopefully provide insight into how easy this can happen. I am fortunate, as somehow I made it, unlike others, such as Deborah Fuller. Like my war injuries, the scars from Subsys will always remain. The prospect of recovery is uncertain. But today in this room amongst fellow victims and experts, families, I believe together we can take the first step towards redemption, because every life has value, every life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fugh-Berman. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Thank you.
I'm Adriane Fugh-Berman, and I'm a professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology. I also direct a project at Georgetown called Farmed Out that does research and education on inappropriate pharmaceutical company marketing. Since the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies have stealthily distorted the perceptions of consumers and healthcare providers about pain and opioids. Opioid manufacturers use drug reps, physicians, consumer groups, medical groups, accreditation and licensing bodies, legislators, medical boards, and the federal government to advance marketing goals to sell more opioids. This aggressive marketing push has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths from the overprescribing of opioids. The U.S. is comprises about 5% of the world's population, but we use about 2/3 of the world's supply of opioids. Drug reps are selected for their presentability and their outgoing natures, and they're trained to assess physicians' personalities, their practice styles, their preferences, and to use this knowledge to influence prescribing. Reps may be genuinely friendly, but they are not genuine friends. Why do physicians fall for this? Well, physicians are overworked, overwhelmed, buried in paperwork, and they feel unappreciated. Drug reps are cheerful, they're charming, they provide both appreciation and information. Unfortunately, the information they provide is innately unreliable. Pharmaceutical companies influence healthcare providers' attitudes and their therapeutic choices through financial incentives that include research grants, educational grants, consulting fees, speaking fees, gifts, and meals. Reciprocity is a strong guiding principle of human interaction. Drug reps provide flattery, friendship, and food. Physicians respond by writing more prescriptions for targeted drugs. Any gift, even a small one, has a powerful effect on human relationships. It fosters a subconscious obligation to reciprocate, and physicians do so through changes in their prescribing practices. Even a meal less than $20 has been shown to increase the number of prescriptions. Industry gifts are also associated with more expensive gifts for Medicare patients. Physicians don't recognize their own vulnerability to commercial information. Studies have consistently shown that physicians don't believe that promotion affects their prescribing, and there have been some educational interventions that have convinced physicians that their colleagues are affected. It's a lot harder to convince them that they themselves are, and Farmed Out actually has the only educational module to date that has convinced physicians of their individual vulnerability to marketing. But drug reps do not visit physicians they cannot influence. They do not visit prescribers they cannot influence. It's good news that in the last 5 years, the number of physicians who refuse to see drug reps has risen steadily. Currently, it's at about 40%. But besides drug reps, industry has many other models and many other modes of influence, including putting misleading articles into medical journals, creating misleading educational modules, and peddling industry-friendly messages to peers at medical meetings and events. These tactics have persuaded healthcare providers to prescribe more opioids to more patients, precipitating the epidemic we have today. Pharmaceutical companies convinced healthcare providers that they were opiophobic and that they were causing suffering to their patients by denying opioids to patients with back pain or arthritis. They persuaded prescribers that patients with pain were somehow immune to addiction. Even when addiction was suspected, physicians were taught that it might not really be addiction, it might be pseudo-addiction, an invented condition that's treated by increasing opioid dosages. Industry created the American Pain Foundation, co-opted other groups, including medical organizations, and they changed state laws to eliminate curbs on opioid prescribing. Between 2006 and 2015, pharmaceutical companies and the advocacy groups they controlled employed 1,350 lobbyists a year in legislative hubs. Industry-influenced regulations and policies ensured that hospitalized patients were and are berated constantly about their level of pain and over-medicated with opioids for that pain. Even a week of opioids can lead a patient into addiction, so many patients are discharged from hospitals already dependent on opioids. Pharmaceutical companies changed the culture of medicine regarding pain and opioids in a way that addicted and continues to addict many patients. It is a misperception to think that most opioid deaths are caused by misuse of opioids or overdoses. In fact, many deaths occur when people are using opioids in exactly the way they were prescribed. Misuse isn't the problem, use is the problem. Sarah Fuller's case is a good example. The fact that an Insys drug rep was in her doctor's office counseling her to use Subsys for an unapproved use is outrageous. The committee's report showing that Insys employees misled pharmacy benefit managers to facilitate payment approvals for Subsys reveals the company's efforts to maximize profits, no matter what the cost was to human health. Opioids are appropriate for end-of-life care and for a few days following surgery or trauma, but for most people, long-term opioid use is a bad idea. Opioids often lose effectiveness over time. Ironically, they cause hyperalgesia or increased sensitivity to pain. Also, withdrawal symptoms can include pain. And while patients may need higher doses over time, higher doses cause more adverse effects. Unfortunately, tolerance to pain-killing effects does not correlate with tolerance of adverse effects. In other words, a patient can still be in pain and die from too much opioids. Promotion of opioids is not in the past. Between 2013 and 2015, 1 in 12 physicians took money from opioid manufacturers, a total of more than $46 million. Industry-friendly messages that pharmaceutical companies are currently perpetuating reassure physicians that prescribing opioids is safe, as long as patients do not have a history of substance abuse or mental illness. Astoundingly, the same industry that created the addiction epidemic is arguing that it can save us from the epidemic with more pills. New opioid formulations are touted as the answer, although they are not less addictive. The term abuse deterrent formulation is dangerous because patients and providers assume that these formulations are less addictive if taken as prescribed. In fact, there was a survey of 1,000 physicians in which half of them thought that primary care physicians, half of them thought that abuse deterrent meant that they were less likely to cause addiction. That's not true. Abuse deterrent formulations are just as likely to cause addiction as conventional preparations. These formulations might be slightly harder to turn into an injectable form, although my students have showed me that 10 minutes on the internet can show you how to turn it into an injectable form. But that's not even important. The most common use the most common way that people misuse opioids is by swallowing them or putting them under the tongue. The opioid addiction epidemic will not end as long as new people are addicted through bad prescribing practices. Prescribers must be educated on the true benefits and harms of opioids through objective sources of information. For example, the District of Columbia Center for Rational Prescribing, which is funded by the Washington, D.C. Department of Health, provides industry-free continuing education for prescribers and pharmacists on opioids and many other topics. This should be a model for the rest of the nation. Education is key, but pharma-influenced education will perpetuate, not end, this epidemic. The White House Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis recommends mandatory education for providers before they receive a DEA license. This recommendation is fatally flawed because the Commission did not specify that these educational modules must be free of pharmaceutical company influence. Industry does not educate against its interests. Industry-funded education of physicians is what created this problem in the first place. As long as prescribers are being educated by companies that market drugs fueling the problem, the body count will continue to rise. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Fleming.
Thank you, Senator. First, I would like to add my appreciation for being invited to attend this hearing and to offer what words I might and my experience that I've had in the process. Also, as a citizen of the state of Missouri, I'd like to thank you for the great work that you're doing here and just say how proud we are of what you're doing. I also want to thank my fellow witnesses who are here, particularly Mr. Buchalter and Ms. Fuller for the testimony that you have given. As a physician, it's quite humbling to hear this, and I just appreciate your courage for coming forward and being willing to do this. I've been a physician for 41 years. Half of that time was as a general internist and geriatrician in my hometown of Moberly, Missouri. I graduated from the University of Missouri School of Medicine in 1976, and following my training also at the University of Missouri in internal medicine and my chief residency there, I returned to my hometown, small rural community. That was a wonderful experience for 20 years. There I cared for many elderly patients, many patients at the end of life. I prescribed a lot of narcotics during that process. And I must tell you that I was always uncomfortable in the process of prescribing narcotics, especially when it was for patients who had been using them for a long time. And I will tell you that physicians have fear when they are confronted with patients, especially ones they don't know well, when they have been using them for prescriptions for narcotics for a long time. They fear both prescribing and not prescribing. And there's a debate that goes on internally and externally within physician community about how best to deal with that. And I'll tell you that we don't deal with it very well. We didn't then, and we still don't do it now. And I think what is happening with the epidemic that's occurring right now will obviate that. You know, the challenges that face physicians as it relates to the pharmaceutical industry and the influence that they have on practice, I learned firsthand. And I had, you know, physicians are inundated with materials, information, and with drug reps who are hoping to influence your practice pattern through the research and development. Over $20 billion a year is spent by the pharmaceutical industry in attempts at doing that. After almost 20 years of practice, I spent 2 wonderful years at Georgetown University doing a research fellowship in the Center for Clinical Bioethics with Dr. Ed Pellegrino, and returned to the University of Missouri on faculty at the medical school there where I had graduated, developed and still directing the Center for Health Ethics that is there, and spent about 7 years as chairman of the Department of Medicine in that School of Medicine. The overarching challenges in training, teaching, and developing practice guidelines for students and residents is huge. And it continues to be a challenge because we are confronted as a safety net hospital in dealing with many patients who come to us with substance abuse disorders and with chronic substance use in the need for ongoing prescribing of opioids. And we still have that same fear and trepidation in prescribing for them in terms of whether to, whether not to, and how to move that forward. My observation over this period of time is that the overuse, misuse, yes, underuse at times of opioids, and of course abuse is at epidemic proportions. And it is growing, which has been said many times by others. The growing cost of health care, the growing influence of the pharmaceutical industry in that process is undeniable. And the opioid component of that is a major piece of that growing cost that we have, which, as we all know, is the highest in the world per capita in terms of what we spend on each patient. I was honored to be the president of the American College of Physicians from 2014 to 2015. Which is the largest specialty physician organization in the world, 150,000 members. And ACP, AMA, the American Osteopathic Association, and many other physician organizations continue to address this through their policy, through white papers, through practice guidelines, and in their efforts at meeting the needs of their members in guiding practice in an appropriate way to better serve the millions of patients that they serve. But it continues to be a challenge. And I'll tell you that, and I actually had dinner with some of my ACP colleagues last night from the Health Policy Office here in D.C. They welcome this investigation. They welcome this process, this dialogue. And I know ACP, AMA, and others will be more than happy to lend whatever skills, whatever evidence-based process that they have to foster a positive outcome, to better educate not only the public but their membership that is there. The opioid epidemic is real. Overdose deaths are up 156%. 38% of U.S. adults are using opioids. That's almost 40%. Almost 1 in 2 patients that come to our clinic are on opioids. 13% of those are misusing them, many without prescription. And we find that prescriptions of opioids that are being given to patients, not infrequently, are being shared. Leftover opioids, leftover drugs that are in the drug shelves, when they're given a 30-month supply, for instance, and they only need them for 2 weeks, they're left over, and they share, and family members will actually share them. It's a very, very common practice, and we never know when it actually occurs. It always astounds me that when patients are admitted to the hospital with mental status changes, one of the routine things that we do is a drug screen, and almost every time we find substances of many kinds, including opioids, in their urine or blood drug screening that we do. So it is really rampant. There are many factors that are contributing to this. Certainly the pharmaceutical influence, the research and development process, the $20 billion plus a year that they spend in efforts to influence prescribing behavior of physicians does have a major influence. But physician prescribing behavior also is a major part of this. We as physicians must be accountable, we must take responsibility, we must recognize that we're not doing as good a job as we should in terms of how we prescribe medications. And also the expectations of the public, and that has been mentioned before. The expectation of the public is that we treat pain, we treat it aggressively, and that we relieve all of pain. And we have long since known as physicians that we cannot relieve all suffering. It is just not possible. And there are other modalities besides opioids that are there. 95% of physicians receive gifts from payments from pharma, from the pharmaceutical industry. And recent data informs us that the use of opioids and the influence and the payments that are out there in 1 in 12 physicians that get that. Almost 10% of physicians, 1 in 10, are receiving some form of payment, even small gifts, in relation to the use of opioids. This is a multifaceted crisis. We need partnerships across all sectors, as CDC has told us, to influence practice training, policy, and systematic solutions. We need better training, which we're not doing as good a job as we could. Yes, we have protocols in place, we have curriculum in place, but it's not landing the way it needs to. We need better non-pharmacologic modalities in the care of our patients. We need better non-addictive drugs. We need universal access to health care. The population of patients that is most grievously affected by the opioid epidemic are the underserved, the unemployed, the uninsured, and those with low health literacy. That is evidence-based. We need improved access to proven modalities, which is a major challenge. We need ways of getting those modalities, that multidisciplinary approach to pain relief and suffering relief, to all sectors of our society. And there are many parts of our society that don't have access to what they need. We need enhanced surveillance, transparency, accountability at all levels, and particularly for those that are directly involved in the patient interface, the healthcare provider-patient relationship that is there. Those are my comments, and I look forward to further.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I'm going to briefly question, and then I'm going to duck out to go to a hearing on the health care bill, and my colleagues will then have a chance to question, and I'll come back. But for this first round, I want to make sure I go through the facts, Mrs. Fuller, of what occurred, because I think it's very important to put it on the record. And I'm going to walk you through this. I know it'll be painful, but please bear with me. In 2014, your daughter sought treatment under the care of Dr. Vivian Matalone of Cherry Hill to manage the medication she took for various health conditions, including fibromyalgia and back pain. And it's my understanding that you and her father were part of the initial consultation with this doctor. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as part of that initial consultation, you told the doctor that she had overcome an addiction to opioids as part of her treatment for her chronic conditions.
Correct.
So the doctor knew that she had struggled with opioids, and you asked the doctor to use other methods besides opioids to treat your daughter.
Yes.
And how long after that did she begin prescribing opioids to your daughter?
About 2 months.
And did you know she had done that?
No.
And so throughout then 2014, she was getting both Oxycontin and Percocet from the same doctor that knew she had an opioid abuse problem.
Yes.
And so in January of 2015, you went back to the doctor with your daughter, correct?
No, my husband did.
Your husband went back to the same doctor.
Correct.
And in this meeting in January 2015 was your daughter, her father, the doctor and a sales representative for Subsys?
Yes.
Did you know at the time a sales representative for Subsys was who the person was in the meeting?
I didn't know. I wasn't made aware of it.
Do you know if your husband or your daughter was aware of it, that this was somebody who was trying to get people to prescribe this medication?
Well, my husband's a baker, so this wouldn't have fazed him. I mean, he would have thought it was like maybe a normal part, like this is just how it works.
This is how it works. And so at that meeting, to your knowledge, did anybody explain to either your daughter or to your husband that Subsys was in fact fentanyl, that it was an even stronger opioid than what your daughter had been prescribed?
No.
All right, so now this is the amazing part. They subscribe Subsys for your daughter, and then 8 months later, she's admitted to a hospital because of the hypersedation and hypoxia from the narcotic that she'd been prescribed by this doctor, correct?
Correct.
And so she's released from the hospital with medical records that say clearly she should not be getting Subsys, correct?
Correct.
And then what happened?
Dr. Mallon continued to prescribe it, and, Sarah trusted her.
And so, in fact, after her release from the hospital with instructions from the doctors at the hospital not to subscribe it, this doctor continued the subscription, and then some 6 months later, your daughter was dead from sepsis. Okay, that is an astounding story. And I think it's important to tell that story because I think because it's understandable your grief, anyone who hears you say you think the cause of death on her death certificate should be homicide need to understand those facts. I mean, frankly, this is, in my opinion, and obviously I'm not a judge here, and I understand there is a lawsuit that's been filed, but this gives medical malpractice a new name. And it is very, very discouraging. Jeffrey, for your situation, you had been prescribed Oxycontin and Opana as a result of your injuries you suffered in Iraq, and you then went to a doctor. And were you aware at the time you went to Dr. Pham that opioids were part of your problem?
No, ma'am. I was actually introduced at Temple through the rabbi to Dr. Tam, and it established rapport and care. I was seeing a fellow physician under his practice who was managing the other medication, and then at that time, Dr. Tam assumed my care. I trusted him, and then took over control of prescribing opiates. But up until that time, I didn't believe I had an addiction problem with opiates, but I could manage. I cycled on and off them throughout the years Walter Reed, and then Subsys came in 2012, and again, that was the end.
Yeah, so give us some perspective and context to the amount of Subsys that you were being subscribed. And by the way, you found out after the fact that this doctor had taken tens of thousands of dollars from this company, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I found out after the fact. I mean, to me it seems conflict of interest, so I would be my first question if I had known, but I trusted him, and he reassured that, I was a special case, increasing my dose, and it went up, and somewhere along the line where I started taking more, needing more, I don't know where that line was. A lot of people that don't understand fentanyl, and again, where I was at 32,000, it's like taking 5,000 Percocets a day. So I was in addition to injectable Dilaudid and Benadryl, and I was in a bad place, and I don't know how I survived. Miracle, I guess, same way I survived multiple ID explosions. But like I said, the pain and process, I was numb. With the multitude of my issues, post-traumatic stress, PDBI, anxiety, I didn't have them on fentanyl. And
You basically didn't have anything on fentanyl.
I didn't have anything.
Right.
But fentanyl it's unique. It's different. It doesn't give you that feeling like you're high. It just makes everything fine.
Everything fine. All right. I'm going to. Senator Harris will have a chance to question now, and then Senator Heitkamp, and hopefully by the time they have completed, I'll be back, and we'll have an opportunity to talk to the doctors about some of these issues. But we're really proud of you, Jeffrey. I know you've struggled mightily with this. I think all of us have family members who have struggled mightily with this. I certainly think my mother, at the end of her life, was certainly opioid addicted. She would probably in heaven right now. She is shaking her finger at me for saying that out loud. But she would be one of those patients that got prescribed opioids for severe arthritic pain and then never managed to figure out how to get off of it. And I think when she tried to get off of it, the pain she experienced was more about the opioids than it was the arthritis. But we've all had family members that have struggled, and I think what you have come back from is a testimony to how strong you are, and you should just know that on days that you don't think anybody realizes what you've been through, there's a whole bunch of us. I hope you feel us at that moment, lifting you up.
Thanks.
And I'll be back in just a little bit.
So in my experience prosecuting transnational criminal organizations, they traffic in guns, drugs, and human beings because there's a great deal of profit to do so. And so regardless of the harm to human life, they are motivated by that profit. I was shocked. I actually leaned back and I asked one of my team members, did he say $20 billion is what the pharmaceutical industry pays to market these drugs? And I was told that it was billion with a B. Is that correct, Dr. Fleming?
Yeah, it's more than 20 billion. Yeah. I mean, it's closer to 28 probably, but the figures vary depending on how you're looking at it. But it's huge, and it grows each year.
And do you have a sense then I mean, there's just some simple math that probably can occur, but I'm not going to do that. You probably have more information. If they're spending $20 billion plus to market it, it must mean that they're getting a really great return on that investment. So do you have any sense of what, or any of you and Dr. Fugh-Berman, of what on an annual basis they profit from the selling of these drugs?
So, and current estimates are even higher, at maybe about $60 billion being spent on promoting drugs. The return on investment is about $12.70 per dollar spent.
I'm going to let my team do the math on that, and then I'll end my point with that. So there's obviously a great profit incentive to market what we know can cause severe addiction and death when used improperly. And so my question is, what do you believe, and any of the panelists, but with a particular emphasis on Dr. Fugh-Berman and Dr. Fleming, what do you believe Congress can do to deter drug companies from being irresponsible and committing any type of fraud or misconduct as it relates to the profit piece? Do you believe there is something Congress can do to address what is clearly a profit motive?
Let me speak to what Congress can do in relation to what physicians ought to be doing. I think part of it is already occurring with the Sunshine Law, the fact that we are required to report even small gifts and make that public knowledge. I don't know if there's public awareness, however. I don't know how much of when I go to a dinner and somebody pays $50 for a great steak dinner and a good bottle of wine, which in D.C. would be a lot more than that, obviously. How many of my patients will go to the whatever site there is to look that up and find out if I went to a drug dinner or not? I think that physicians need to take ownership of that transparency. The problem in the whole issue of monetary gain really starts at the bedside, and the incentives are there. I think working closely with ACP, AMA, other large physician organizations, and trying to develop strategies in terms of how to shift physician behavior and shift physician attitudes is going to be important. But creating levels of accountability, transparency, and reporting, I think are going to be really a large component of that.
I agree with that. And that's the great thing about technology. We can now have open data in a way we never could before that can allow the public to gain access to and insight and sunshine into what we're all doing.
We need to expand that transparency to gifts to advocacy groups, gifts to medical organizations, that all payments that pharmaceutical companies make to any entity should be public information. That would be really important. Also, the Sunshine Act only covers physicians. It needs to cover other prescribers and other healthcare providers who are also being targeted by pharmaceutical companies. We're the only country in the world where the government is forbidden to negotiate with drug companies about drug prices. That needs to change as well. We need to increase public funding of research. That the most biomedical research now is being funded by pharmaceutical companies, and we need to get pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies and other biomedical companies completely out of healthcare provider education. There has to be a bright line there.
Yep, and you said that in your testimony. That was very helpful. So I'd like any of you to talk a bit about the contrast between the way we handled the crack epidemic and the opioid epidemic. I think there are some obvious differences. I think for the first time, late, but better late than never, we are figuring out that this is something, addiction is an issue that should be treated as a public health matter and not a criminal justice matter. We should not criminalize drug addiction. But are there other lessons that we are learning or learned from the way we handled the crack epidemic that can be instructive on a better use of public resources to address this issue?
Well, we know how to deal with opioid addiction. We actually have effective medication-assisted treatment, but I think it's really important to look at the motivations of what treatments are being pushed. There have been laws that have been introduced. There have been more than 100 bills that have been introduced in state legislature, including 49, I believe, with identical language that has been provided by pharmaceutical companies on paying for abuse deterrent formulations, which are not less addictive, but are 10 times more expensive than conventional preparations. And there has also been language introduced into state laws about pushing specific medication-assisted treatments, which are not proven. We do have ones that are proven. So buprenorphine-based treatments, methadone-based treatments are effective. We know how to treat opioid addiction. It doesn't mean that it's easy. But we know how to treat it. We need to be spending money on treating the problem, treating people with medication-assisted treatment for this problem, and not thinking that there's going to be magic pills created by pharmaceutical companies that are going to make this go away.
Dr. Fleming, you want to?
I think one major difference in the crack cocaine epidemic and the present opioid epidemic is that, crack cocaine is clearly an illegal substance. And the opioid epidemic is highly fueled by legal substances, by prescribed medications that licensed physicians are providing and other healthcare providers are providing to patients with or without indications. Opioids are being utilized both on demand and with the expectation of physician groups that they ensure patient-centeredness, they take care of their patients, and that they seek patient satisfaction. I mean, physicians, one of the things that we get paid for is to keep our patients satisfied. And one of the greatest dissatisfiers is when pain is not relieved. And that's when I look at patient satisfaction scores on my faculty, you know, the poor pain relief is one of the major factors that's involved with that. So we have to change the microscope we use in looking at that interaction in terms of how physicians are getting paid and what their incentives are for their behavior. We also need to take it to the systems level, I think, in terms of ensuring that patients with certain conditions get certain kinds of services at time of discharge, both in the acute care setting and out. In our recent study found that 40% of those with heroin overdose and 60% of those with prescription overdose filled a prescription within 6 months following their overdose with the same medication for which they were hospitalized with the overdose. 60%. Opioid, legal drug. Only 3.6 were referred to a medication-assisted treatment program following opioid overdose. 3.6% of that. The incentives for hospitalization are to get the patient out of the hospital, decrease length of stay, get that length of stay down to 2.3 so they can optimize, improve the margin. You know, it gets down to the economy of health, the economy of healthcare. So we need to create the right incentives to get the right kinds of programs in place and make it automated. Don't leave it up to the physician. The physician's got a lot of things going on. Put it on the team's back, which includes hospital administration, it includes hospital systems that create a requirement through Joint Commission, through other kinds of regulatory mechanisms to say, if they come in with this diagnosis, or if a certain blood test comes back with this finding in a drug screen, then there's an automatic referral. And that needs to occur before that patient is discharged, and hold the team accountable for that referral.
Thank you.
I think there's a real struggle here to both doctors, kind of the law of mixed messages. And you heard this, you know, against every logical conclusion that we all would draw if we weren't consulting a professional. Ms. Fuller took her doctor's advice, Mr. Buchalter took his doctor's advice, and they failed him. And so we've got to have a system in place where physicians are our first line of defense. And that may sound harsh, but you know, we're talking about medical institutions, pharmaceutical companies with huge profit motivation. That they're going to be around, that system's going to be around, whether it's profit motivation of a cartel or whether it's a profit motivation of a legitimate pharmaceutical organization, you know, obviously formulated as an American corporation or a foreign corporation. Physicians are always going to be listened to more than any of those people. And so the availability of resources for physicians to understand this issue and also to do the right thing, which is first and foremost do no harm. And you know, I tell a personal story. My husband's a physician. And until we had a system in North Dakota that basically allowed him to access a database where he could see, as we call them, drug-seeking behaviors, he didn't have access to any of that. So now we have a database. But the reality is, if he had a suspicion that this person is seeking drugs, legal drugs, and has a problem, and he turned him away, he always knew there was going to be a physician that would write that prescription. It's harder to do that now because of the databases that are available. It's harder to do that now. But I want to go back, Dr. Fleming, what you're saying is the referral to legitimate either pain management clinics or addiction clinics. One of the problems that we have is there aren't any of those available. I mean, when you say 3.6, that doesn't surprise me, because access to that kind of medication-assisted treatment is not readily available, and it's certainly not available in rural communities. And so what can we do that would make that access more available? Dr. Fleming.
Well, require it by law. and then fund it. That sounds a little flippant, and I apologize for that, but
I don't think that's flippant at all.
You know, I look back at what John Danforth did in the Danforth Amendment, where systems were required to ask patients if they had healthcare directories back in 1991, following Nancy Cruzan, the Nancy Cruzan case. Now, the Patient Self-Determination Act, in many feel failed because it didn't go far enough in requiring the actual activity of participating with patients in healthcare planning, in filling, in not just completing healthcare directives, but actually talking about them and ensuring the documentation was there and that those were followed. But every patient that's admitted to any federally funded system of any kind, whether it's a hospital, a long-term care facility, home hospice, or whatever, there's a requirement that they ask the question, do you have a healthcare directive? If not, would you like information for that? Now, that's where it stops. That's where it fell short of what really needs to occur. There's been a lot of debate about that in the bioethics community, as you can well imagine, and in the palliative care community. There needs to be an expectation. We all report now. We report when we're given gifts from pharma. We report when we document when we write a prescription for an opioid. There's now a database, Missouri, which was the last state in the union to have that database available, now has that. It's not perfect, but it is something. And so we now have a means by which we can check to see where prescriptions are getting filled. Information is power. And in having that information available to the prescribing physician, I couldn't agree more, Senator, that it's not just the physician, but other healthcare providers who are at the bedside, who has that relationship with the patient, that has that trust relationship. As Jeffrey mentioned, he trusted his physician, not knowing that his physician was getting money from pharma, and he trusted his physician to make the right decision. And the ball got dropped on that. Our patients still trust us to make the right decision for them because our obligation is to the welfare of that patient. That's our primary and ultimate goal above everything else, above self-interest and everything. Now, that's the ideal. I would say that that ideal is not met most of the time because there are too many other influences on that decision that's occurring, not just monetary influences, but influences on regulation, on influences in dealing with the electronic medical record, which has become a bane to most physicians' existence. There are many barriers to clean, concise, appropriate decision-making, shared decision-making with patients. And when you're in an environment of doc for the day, when you see different physicians, now that is improved. And I think one reason that opioid prescribing has actually gone down over the last few years is because of the reporting process that's occurring.
I think that's
but we're not going far enough. We need to do more of that.
It's a myth that we have an epidemic of untreated pain in this country. That is a myth that has been perpetuated by the pharmaceutical industry. We have an epidemic of addiction. We do not have an epidemic of untreated pain, and the statistics that have been thrown around on that include people whose pain is minor, includes people whose pain is being adequately treated. I won't make people raise their hands, but there's probably a lot of people in the room where something is hurting them somewhere. That doesn't mean that they need to be on opioids. We need to train physicians not to add to the epidemic by overprescribing opioids, but also to learn how to do medication-assisted treatment. The top 4 prescribers of opioids are family medicine, internal medicine, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. Nurse practitioners and physician assistants write 1 out of 4 prescriptions in the United States at this point, and are heavily targeted by pharma and are under the radar because the federal law does not gather payments on them, although Washington, D.C., interestingly, actually does. But we're not allowed to disclose who they're for. Anyway, we need to putting more pain clinics into place isn't really the answer. It's been shown at this point that not only are opioids ineffective for chronic pain because of increasing hyperalgesia, but they actually contribute to enhanced disability and less function over time.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but I think obviously you have two situations here in Sarah's and Jeffrey's where people were suffering from some kind of pain that drove them to a physician with the need of services, different services than what they received, but definitely the need of medical assistance.
Absolutely. And for some people, there are many treatments for pain that physicians and other prescribers are actually completely unaware of. There's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, there's antidepressants, anti-seizure medications, there's local anesthetics, there's ketamine, there's cannabinoids, there's manipulative therapies, there's exercise. There are things for which there are a lot of randomized controlled trials showing that they're helpful, and docs aren't learning about them.
I think, Jeffrey, you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I mean, the complexities, but to me this is really simple, and until Congress takes action, do no harm, physician standard of care. I have yet to find where long-term opioid use of any sort has been proven to be beneficial. Dr. Tim is still currently prescribing today without any penalty. The medical board decided that just don't do it again.
Well,
sorry, ma'am.
One of the things that I think a center of excellence for managing, especially veterans, returning Iraqi, Afghani war veterans, Walter Reed basically trying to create alternative therapies, whether it's art therapy, whether it's movement therapy, whether it is in fact just meditation, that can be very effective for providing some relief from chronic pain. But I think we need to understand that there are centers, populations that do suffer from chronic pain that we need to deal with. Now, I think we also need to educate patients when they come in. I have a long history working with drug enforcement in my state. I had one of my very good friends who is a drug enforcement agent had a heart attack, and the first thing they wanted to give him when he woke up from his bypass surgery was morphine. And he just said, get it away from me, because he understands and has seen, the unintended consequences of that kind of access. We don't do enough to warn patients in this country that, yes, you can take the risk, you can get this pain relief, but understand there may be consequences to getting that pain relief that you aren't aware of. And just want to go to your point, which is a story that I tell. We talk about addiction with opioids and with fentanyl, heroin, but we have addictions with alcohol. We have with new structures and new research being done on how do we do medically assisted treatment in all these areas. But we had a epidemic and a continuing epidemic of methamphetamine, and with even stronger methamphetamine products coming into my state. And we had a guy tattooed up in a doctor's office, literally crying because he couldn't get high anymore. So, this idea that this is the panacea, not managed properly, it can be another monkey on the back with no pain relief. And I think that's something Dr. Berman, I think your message needs to be heard over and over again, that the unintended consequences aren't just addiction, but no relief from pain if you are legitimately experiencing pain. And it's just tragic what's happening. You have any more questions? Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, the back of the envelope math on the profit of the industry a year is about $765 billion profit. I'd like to move over to one other related topic, which is I'm told, and that we're also in this environment seeing fraud against insurance companies. Is that something that any of you is familiar with and can talk about and address?
Well,
yes.
Senator, I mean,
Mr. Buchalter.
I know specifically one of the reasons I was targeted is because the TRICARE doesn't have a pre-authorization for Subsys. It's the only insurance company that would have filled it for my injuries. But I know Insys has been involved subsequently with defrauding insurance companies, but they didn't have to with TRICARE. And with veterans that are retired, they're targets for whatever's new, whatever's the most expensive,
Yeah.
and as high as they can take them. And that's what happened, and it's happening.
Thank you.
And one thing about the state level, you know, pharmaceutical companies will target state legislature with bills that require payment for specific drugs, including abuse deterrent formulation. So since 2012, 21 bills have become law, and Maryland, Maine, Massachusetts, Florida, and West Virginia currently require insurers to pay for abuse deterrent formulations. So that's something else that I would consider. It's not exactly fraud on insurers, but it's certainly compelling them to spend money they don't need to.
Right. Thank you.
I might also mention that, you know, and I've been involved in a lot of pre-certification processes over the years, particularly when I was in practice. I never did it. Every once in a while, I would actually talk to a physician at whatever it was, whether it was an intervention, whether it was a medication, whether it was a surgery or whatever. It would be a physician-to-physician kinds of discussion. And whenever I was talking, you know, when I was doing it, and when it got to my level, they required that, they always approved it because I could explain to them my thinking and why we were doing it, and et cetera. When, for most drugs where pre-approval is needed, the physician's not involved. The marching orders for whoever the approver is, and it's usually at the systems level, it may be at a pharmacy, it may be out of the physician's office, it may be one of the other healthcare team, is get this approved. So do whatever it takes to get, we've already made the decision, we're going to do this, I'm going to prescribe this, I'm going to follow this course of treatment, whether it may be a chemotherapeutic agent, whatever, and do whatever you can not to get me involved in that because I don't have time.
Right.
That time is a major commodity, and the lack of that for physicians is a variable in this that we really do need to take into consideration, and the complexity of the EMR, which is really complicated practice rather than simplified. That has not been conducive to that. So, you know, the fact that we might lose our patient, we might lose that income from the patient, and it's just easier to write the prescription.
Yeah.
And do what they want to make them happy, and then we can move on to the next patient because we're already 30 minutes behind. Those are the realities of practice.
I thank you for your candor and courage, everyone. And Ms. Fuller.
Because I know in Sarah's case, when I heard the phone call that my attorney obtained, or her state attorney obtained, where they were getting authorization for Subsys and lying. Just absolute lying. There's just no other term for it. Where had, you know, maybe the people in Envision been a little bit more on the ball, had Insys Therapeutics not been so insidious, you know, my daughter'd still be here. But because they lied, out and out lied. I mean, they said she had cancer, they said she had breakthrough cancer pain. None of that was true. So maybe there needs to be a tightening on the authorization because they approved a drug that was $250,000 at the end where there were no other bills for cancer. Yeah. Now, to me, that's an easy one. If you're not getting bills for cancer, then you obviously don't need a drug for breakthrough cancer pain. That's right. So because of the lack of anybody even caring, my daughter died.
Thank you. Senator McCaskill, again, thank you for your leadership on this. This has been an incredible hearing.
Yeah, it is stunning if you really begin to dissect this. And, you know, 5% of the world's population and 2/3 of the world's opioids I want to get back to Ms. Fuller and Mr. Buchalter in just a minute, but I wanted to ask the doctors here. I've heard from doctors that when we started making pain one of the vitals, that was the beginning of this. And do you have, Dr. Fugh-Berman, do you have evidence that it was the pharmaceutical industry that pushed to make pain a vital? Because that happened
Yes.
Did that happen in the 90s?
In the 1990s. So there is at least indirect evidence, but it's very clear that that the pharmaceutical industry pushed for pain to be the fifth vital sign. So the vital signs are blood pressure, pulse, respiration, temperature, which are things that can be seen and measured, where pain is a symptom which can only be felt and not measured. And that was and it's led to hospitals requiring, and this is still today, requiring that patients be asked multiple times a day whether they're in pain, to rate that pain, and if they say it's 7 or above, they're often given
my mom always
opioids.
said 10. She knew. I mean, and I would go, "You're not at 10, stop it." And it was just unbelievable to me. Well, so why can't we take pain away as a vital? Because I've had doctors saying, well,
Right.
I'm afraid not to do this because if I don't do it, it will be reflected in the charts, it will be reflected in my review, and it could impact how much money I make and whether or not I'm successful in my career.
Well,
Is that true?
The Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing have written letters, petitioned both the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which has 4 questions on the patient satisfaction survey, the HCAHPS survey on pain, that are linked to reimbursement. And I'm happy to say that by the end of this year, those questions will no longer be linked to reimbursement. However, the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Hospitals has been very defensive. PROP has also petitioned the Joint Commission to stop berating patients about their level of pain, and to stop discussing pain as a fifth vital sign, and they have been very defensive and not helpful in this regard.
So we need to follow up on that. Because if, I guarantee you, my mother was the type of person that if she was at a level 10 pain, they would know about it, even if they weren't being asked.
It's really important because the physicians and nurses in the hospital often don't want to give opioids to the patients in the hospital, but they feel that they have to because they're being pressured by hospital administrators.
Mr. Buchalter, what did the doctors at Fort Belvoir recommend for your pain management after you were discharged from the hospital? Talk a little bit about your recovery and what that journey has been like.
It's still ongoing. It's painful. So it started February 2016. Fortunately, I don't know. I was still taking the Subsys, but I got saved by bilateral leg infections caused from Benadryl injections, also prescribed, and attention was brought to the obscenity of how much fentanyl I was taking and what had happened. And so that's when the physician panicked, discharged me, wrote me a script for every strength, and told me to taper myself off. I was an addict at that point, so that was not going to work out so well. Wrote me for 80 milligram Moxie. I was taking 6 at a time. Ended up really sick and withdrawal. Haven't been still well over 8,000 micrograms a day. And the addiction team, they didn't really know what to do. They had to consult an anesthesiologist, put me in the ICU for 7 days under sedation, 15 milligrams of Ativan, propofol, and...
So essentially they put you like in a coma.
They tried to, but it didn't
aid
work.
your withdrawal?
And they kept, everything they tried, and they were amazed that it still struggled, and they couldn't put me out. The withdrawals, fortunately, I don't remember because of the benzos. I don't remember, it seems like a 4-hour nightmare versus a 7-day, but vividly. But the real pain started after, the depletion in my brain, and still recovery is lost 50 pounds, all these other medical issues started presenting. And, you know, I hold the world record for the highest dosage of opiates ever prescribed. Not one I ever thought that I would. And so there's not a lot of insight into long-term recovery. It's not, you know, prognosis, prospect. So there's fear and uncertainty. I was then managed on, and currently managed on, Suboxone treatment, low dose, because of the amount of receptors that were established. And it's foreseeably possible that I may always have to maintain that. And then it's just been a struggle to regain the totality of that 2012 to 2016, the destruction, the absence of my life, totality, financially, socially, everything. You know, a lot of my pain was caused from anxiety, you know, post-traumatic stress. Fentanyl, I didn't have anxiety, I didn't have nightmares, I didn't have those issues. And so, you know, pain's an issue. I deal with it now. You know, it wasn't that I didn't have pain. It was the motivation, standard of care as to why. I mean, we know that it doesn't work for long term. And it's been a long road. And like I said, 18 months later, and it's still uncertain.
Yeah. When I went over to Walter Reed in 2007, when there was the crisis in terms of the conditions that some of the men were being asked to live in that were being treated long term, and I took a tour, and what struck me, and I'd come from a background where when I was the prosecutor in Kansas City, we had a local tax that not only helped fund police officers in drug crimes, but it did prevention and treatment. So I was very familiar with treatment protocols. I started one of the first drug courts in the country back in the early 90s. So I'm very, very familiar with treatment protocols when it comes to substance abuse issues. I tour Walter Reed, and in every room I looked in, on the dresser was 5 or 6 bottles of pills and usually a couple bottles of whiskey. So I started looking on the bulletin boards to see if there was any notification of any kind of groups meeting, any notification of substance abuse counselors. And I was stunned when I asked the people there, and it was clear to me that there was overprescribing going on. And that people, especially when you have the anxiety that PTSD represents in somebody's life, that there was this clearly willingness to prescribe without any kind of countermeasure or counter message that we're here to help you on substance abuse. Did you find that in terms of your treatment? Was there ever anybody who approached you about substance abuse treatment and your ability to access free medical care as it relates to substance abuse treatment?
You know, my first introduction to opioids, I think minus the surgery when I was 18 on my knee for like a couple days, was when I first got to Walter Reed. Was on the inpatient, you know, for PTSD treatment. And I had pain issues, you know, significant, you know, both physical and psychological issues. And that was the first time I was introduced to fentanyl by a simple, I think, 12 microgram patch. And that lasted for a couple months. It seemed to help, but then you know, not being ignorant, being afraid of getting addicted, I decided myself, nobody counseled me, to just stop. And that's when I first learned, you know, the power of these medications and getting off of them. You know, and it was at that time, you know, I took them as prescribed, but it was really the beginning of a history of an addiction. And again, the impunity from the military, they don't, you know, the Malone House, the old Walter Reed, I mean, you're right. It was trading methadone, drugs, I mean, it's...
One problem for another.
Yeah.
Mrs. Fuller, during the course of Sarah's treatment, did you notice changes of her behavior? Was there was there concern between the time she first went to Dr. Madelone in terms of how she was responding to the medications that she was being given?
Well, yeah, she became much more lethargic. I mean, she would spend days in her room, which she had those darkening shades, and she'd spend days in a pitch black room. She would pretty much wear her pajamas every day, all day, because she couldn't care less if she had to get dressed. She started going out less with friends and family, and she would fall asleep on the toilet and then fall over and bang her head on the bathtub. She'd fall out of bed and wake up on the floor. And as much as, and we kept telling her, you need to talk to the doctor because this isn't right.
Right. Did you all try to talk to the doctor at any time during this?
Well, I had talked to the doctor, like, on a personal level, and she said that it was a matter of her body getting used to it, that once her body got used to it, then those side effects would go away or would be lessened. But 2 weeks before she died, she kept saying she felt like she was dying. And we urged her because, I mean, she was an adult. There wasn't a lot
Right.
we could do as far as that goes. It's not like she's 3 and we can
Right.
pull her out by the hand.
Right.
But like I said, we weren't told about how bad this particular, I never heard of it.
Doctor, did Dr. Tam ever discuss with you, Mr. Buchalter, the risks of addiction? Did he ever discuss with you? Was there any acknowledgement on his part about the amount of fentanyl he was prescribing for you?
No, ma'am. In fact, he indicated that he had no fear of addiction. It's why he actually prescribed.
He's actually said, I have no fear of addiction?
That's why he gave me parental, which is injectable, Dilaudid in addition, hydromorphone, Benadryl, which potentiates it.
Is he still practicing?
Yes, the medical board gave him no sanctions, nothing. He's got a full license. Somebody pulled a favor.
Guys, can you address that, doctors? How do you give someone the dosage of fentanyl this doctor gave and have absolutely no consequences to his medical practice? How does that happen?
He knows somebody.
I don't know. To me, this is unconscionable, and there may be mitigating circumstances. I do know that physician recovery programs that are supported by state boards of healing arts, that licensed physicians at the state level do everything they can to keep physicians in practice, to get them their licenses back and do it safely. And most state boards are pretty good. Missouri's got one of the best. But I obviously can't speak to this particular case because I don't know all the parameters. But to me, it's unbelievable.
Physicians are held to a community standard of care, and if the community standard of care is illogical and not science-based, that's still the standard that you're held to.
I can speak. My mother actually is the one who filed the complaint. She was a former RN, and things, the highest level, I guess, in Maryland, they're, with the way they go about evaluating these, it had reached that. I had given an over-the-phone interview, and then all of a sudden, my mother received a letter saying the lowest level of basically just don't do it again, but there's no way for the public or anything. It doesn't, he's no fined, he's not suspended, he still has his control license, practicing.
So if you go on a website trying to look up if there's been any negative action taken against Dr. Tam, you would not find anything?
Not unless the lawsuit, obviously you can go to the judiciary, but as far as if looking for a clinician, unless, patient comments, but you wouldn't know, no. Right. And again, Annapolis, and I don't understand. I
want to talk a little bit about the distribution of this drug. Mrs. Fuller, in your complaint, you state that Linden Care, the method by which Insys distributes this drug to patients intentionally and recklessly disregarded the law by dispensing a large carton of Subsys to your daughter's doorstep. You know, talk about that a little bit. I mean, this is one of these situations where this drug is delivered to someone's doorstep, and obviously the amount that was brought was higher than it should have been, correct?
Correct.
And was there any ability to hold Linden Care responsible in terms of that kind of dangerous situation?
Well, yeah, because they were FedExing it. I mean, it wasn't even that she had to go in and get it. They just mailed it to her. I mean, she had to be there to sign for it. But other than that, I mean, didn't seem to be, a secure way to be sending something of that nature. Nor did they ever, to my knowledge, try and make sure that it went with anything else she may be taking. And they just kept sending it. And sometimes it was sent, the prescription was faxed to them.
Yeah,
the original was mailed.
In the tape, they actually say we'd like her to get a year's worth.
Well, it came in a month's supply, but
yeah, but they wanted to get the prescription approved for a year.
She went from 200 to 600 every 4 hours. I mean, she was just prescribed 200 the first time around, and then the next prescription was for 600 every 4 hours. So she was taking 3,600 units a day, and just came to her, just in a box.
What about how you got your prescriptions, Mr. Buchalter? How did that occur?
Well, majority came from 2 pharmacies local. Obviously, it's very expensive. TRICARE paid a few $1 million for it. So they don't stock it. So it was Giant Pharmacy and another local pharmacy up in Annapolis, right underneath the doctor's office, that were more than happy to order $80,000 worth of medication. I would get 16, at the end I was getting 16 of those boxes a month.
You were getting 16 of these boxes a month?
Yes, ma'am. I was taking 1,600, and then 2 hours later I would take 8, and then 16, 8, all day long.
So were the pharmacies happy to see you coming?
Oh, yes. And in fact, when they messed up, Giant gave me gift cards to go food shopping because they screwed the order up.
Okay. I'd like to briefly touch on advertising, the advertising of these drugs. The whole area of advertising prescription drugs, it's like we've lost our minds. The average American watches 16 hours of pharmaceutical drug advertisements a year on television. 16 hours of just prescription drug advertising. And what I really noticed is the uptick in advertising for the drug that solves constipation around opioids. I mean, they are spending a bundle of money advertising that, which gives you some indication of the enormity of the problem as it relates to opioids. And what about the fact that these guys are paying docs? And by the way, nurses can still get paid without us knowing about it because they're not, right? Nurses are not subject to the Sunshine Act, which we now have some transparency on payments to doctors for writing in journals or for giving speeches. But what would you all recommend about a way forward out of this conflict of interest quagmire as it relates to people who prescribe and people who sell? You said 40% of the docs no longer see sales folks. That doesn't change when a patient comes in and says, well, I saw that if I take this, I'm going to be thin and run through fields and be happy for my condition. You've just got to give me this drug. Clearly that's influencing doctors because the prescriptions are clearly supporting this kind of level of advertising. Direct-to-consumer
promotion certainly increases the willingness of patients to take drugs that they see on TV, but the prescriber still holds the prescription pad. And I can tell you that within industry, they feel that their dollars are much better spent on promoting to prescribers than promoting to consumers. There's still about $5 billion a year spent on promoting to consumers. That's not nothing. But their dollars are better spent on promoting to doctors. And the area that I'm most interested is really covert promotion. So to some extent, doctors do know that drug reps are there to sell drugs. People do know that advertising is there to sell drugs. These are not unimportant, but what I think is even more important are the covert methods of influence. So manipulating articles in the medical literature, manipulating research, messages and continuing medical education, events that are supposed to be educational that are not educational.
So how can we figure that part out? We're investigating that right now. And so any input you have on this would be very helpful. This CME deal where a CME could do that's a continuing medical education, can do a whole presentation on pain management and never mention opioid addiction. I mean,
yes.
It seems like to me the light bulb should go on with some doctors sitting there. How come they're not talking about the addiction problem?
That's an area that we can definitely help in. Physicians and accreditors are not good at identifying marketing messages in continuing education. And in fact, it is difficult because marketing for a drug starts 7 to 10 years before a drug comes on the market. Many of the marketing messages don't actually mention a drug at all. The marketing messages may merely exaggerate the existence of a disease state or even invent a disease state. Certainly opioid-induced constipation wasn't a separate disease state that we learned about in medical school. But there's many diseases that are actually invented by pharmaceutical companies in order to sell drugs. But there are all of these covert methods. CME is definitely one of them, and we're not the accreditors and the purveyors of CME are either they're being paid by pharmaceutical either the purveyors are being paid by pharmaceutical companies, or they're not able to see these marketing messages. They're difficult to see, but that's actually an area that we specialize in.
Well, we'll follow up with you on that. I want to thank you all for being here today. I think we have learned a lot. I think it's startling, the personal stories that the two of you bring to this. Is there anything else that you would like to make sure you say today? I am so grateful for you, for both of you, to be here and to share your grief and your struggles in this way. I want to make sure and give you an opportunity if there's anything else you want to say about this subject that would go into the record.
Yeah, well, with Insys Therapeutics and the way they are promoting the off-label use of Subsys, people have to be aware if they're currently taking it or a doctor suggesting they take it, they really should seek a second opinion because, as you can see in our case, it can kill.
So your bottom line message would be if you have been prescribed Subsys and you do not have a cancer diagnosis, you need to find another doctor.
Absolutely.
I think they need to take it off the market. I don't think there's an indication for that strong of a medication that can't be otherwise used. So I don't think it should even be a medication. I think the FDA should pull it. Medication is that dangerous, where one dose can kill you the first time.
And it now has overtaken heroin as the #1 killer.
You know, I mean, I'm not naive. It comes down to money, this whole thing, you know. Making it doctors driven. Doctors have been kind of accountable, just like, you know, I train law enforcement, they're accountable to their profession. Different standards, different, but you know, if they're not being held accountable, if it's easy for them, opioid-induced constipation. I mean, it's Movantik, but Relistor, which is methyl naltrexone, which is Narcan, but it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So you basically endure the worst abdominal cramps you've ever can imagine until you have a bowel movement. they found a way to take it orally. You see the commercial and it's just this happy guy, you know, it's just the subtle messaging and referring.
Yeah, he's out on a construction site.
The couple, like everything's great.
He's on opioids to the point that he needs this drug, but he's out there in a construction site. I'm like, what is wrong with this picture? It's a little bit like the two people that need Cialis, but they have two bathtubs there. Like, that's going to happen, you know?
But, you know, not to be, you know, crude, but, I mean, when you haven't had a bowel movement, you'll do anything to do that. So, I mean, suppositories, all the stuff you don't see. So they create a drug to solve the problem, you know, to pacify a drug, the symptom. Again, you know, I go back to my first point. Where's the literature that shows that long-term opioid use in any clinical setting, terminal, unless it's terminal or acute? And if that is known, then why is that not the standard of care? And if it's not practiced, then why are the doctors keeping their license?
I think it's a very, very good point, Mr. Buchalter. Anything else from the doctors?
There's not enough attention paid to people who actually are victims of adverse drug reactions and misuse of drugs, but there's a lot of attention that's paid to sufferers from diseases. There are many fake consumer advocacy groups. There's a lot of corruption of professional groups. We really need to have transparency of payments from pharmaceutical and other biomedical companies to consumer and professional groups, and those groups should be required on the 990s, on the SEC forms, to disclose exactly who is giving them money. That would be very useful for.
Yeah, so we should write a letter to them and ask them.
That would be really, very useful for the future, and we need.
So yeah, let's get the list. If you can help us with a list of some of the advocacy organizations that you think are in the process of being bought off by these pharmaceutical companies, that would be terrific.
It would be a lot easier to give you a list of the ones that aren't. There are thousands of thousands of advocacy organizations taking money from pharma, and there's about 17 that are not. But that's an area that we're working on as well. But that would be an area to address legislatively. And if there's any way legislatively to separate to separate industry from health professional education, that would be great.
Dr. Fleming?
I guess I'd just like to, for all of us to remember that, you know, the drugs that we're talking about have gone through millions of dollars of developmental process, research and development, and to bring them to a point where the FDA has approved them for a specific purpose in helping patients that truly need them. There are patients out there, and you know, Subsys is one of them, that is indicated for a subset of patients with breakthrough pain who are dying of cancer. And those patients still need that medicine. The problem is that we are victim of our own success. And as long as we have a market-driven healthcare system, which it is, even in the nonprofit sector, we're going to be dealing with this. We have to have the political will and the social will across all sectors of society to be able to be transparent, to hold everyone accountable, especially those who are doing the prescribing and those who are doing the selling, to hold ourselves accountable, and to make sure that we do it right and that we're serving those that are intended to be served by the efforts that we are making at the research level and at the clinical practice guideline level. And that is what has happened here is that it has just become tainted. The slippery slope that has been driven by, well, greed, by profit, I think is one that has been, that's been part of our, you know, I mean, that's been there for 50 years since we really started developing powerful drugs and powerful interventions for patients that otherwise would have not survived. So I think we just need to take a step back and decide, are we, I mean, is the market going to be what's going to be driving us? I mean, we are a consumer society. You know, we're based on a democracy. We're based on freedom, freedom to market, freedom to advertise to patients. If we're going to control that, if we're going to create regulatory processes to actually control it, and it's going to be hard to do. But I think that you're going to find that most physician organizations are going to be supportive of reasonable attempts to try to regulate that process so that we can protect our patients.
Well, I think I understand the point you're making, and I respect it. But this notion that we are falling prostrate at the altar of, well, they've spent so much money developing a drug, therefore we've got to look after them. That dog just doesn't hunt with me. I mean, if they spent that kind of money on a drug that should have a very limited applicability, then shame on them for having wasted all that money on a drug that should have a very limited applicability. But that's not the problem. And what I see, doctor, is a cost-benefit analysis, any crude cost-benefit analysis with this particular drug, Subsys, would show that the cost has far exceeded the benefit in terms of pain management in this country. And there are other things that can be used to manage pain, and I guess maybe I could buy the point you're making if there was going to be consequences for a doctor that prescribed it in situations other than end-of-life breakthrough cancer pain. But that's the problem here, is that doctors are prescribing it in other places and nothing's happening to these doctors. And until the medical community is willing to say, we think it's important that end-of-life breakthrough cancer pain have Subsys, and by the way, we're willing to enforce that as the community standard, instead of there being some amorphous community standard, well, other people are using it for other kinds of pain or for opioid tolerance in general, then we're going to have more young women that are going to have families like Deborah Fuller's family mourning their deaths, and to say nothing of the synthetic problem that is now flooding the black market. So, and I don't see the medical community standing up and saying we're going to hold ourselves accountable for anybody who prescribes it in anything other than that approved use. So maybe, I mean, I know I can get a lot of attention from the medical community. I'll put in the bill that any doctor who prescribes Subsys for anything other than breakthrough cancer pain at end of life loses their license. Now, I'd get a lot of reaction from the AMA on that. But that's my frustration here. There are lots of good guys like you out there, and the vast majority. But there's a Dr. Tam out there practicing right now who almost killed this man. And there's a doctor who literally, after knowing she should not have that prescription, gave that prescription to, after she'd been hospitalized. Is she still practicing?
No.
No.
Well, Democratic states.
So hopefully we will make progress on this, but this really helps illuminate the problem. And I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. I respect your expertise. I particularly respect the losses that you all have suffered, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, I got this letter from